Good afternoon. My name is Christina Rogers. I'm the program manager of the Community Systems Statewide Supports Team at Illinois Action for Children. This is our final day of our week of webinars. So if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And if you've been with us every day so far, welcome back. We have partnered with Tamarack Institute to host this series to equip and support you in community systems building. This week-long webinar series wouldn't be possible without generous funding from Illinois State Board of Education. And so now I'd like to introduce you to Pamela Teitelbaum, who will be your trainer, and pass it off to her.
Thank you very much, Christina. Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to be here. I want to just, I'll be starting shortly. I'm just going to introduce my colleague, Duncan. He's just going to go over a few technical issues or supports with you. Pass it over to him now.
Yeah, thanks, Pamela, and thanks, Christina, for the introduction. Just wanted to go over a few notes that will help you make the most out of today's call. The first is that we'd love to hear from you. So if you have comments or any links you'd like to share at any point throughout the presentation, we welcome you to submit them using the chat function on your Zoom client. As well, we're going to have a time for Q&A at the end of today's presentation. So we invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And we'll try our best to get to those. If you have any technical problems today, feel free to reach out to me using the chat function, and I'll do my best to assist you. And I believe that covers it. So back to you, Pamela.
Thanks a lot, Duncan. So before we begin, I would just like to go over our gratitude and acknowledgement. We begin the workshop by acknowledging that we are meeting on Indigenous land. As settlers, we're grateful for the opportunity to meet, and we thank all the generations of Indigenous peoples who have taken care of this land. As well, we recognize that contributions and historic importance of Indigenous peoples must be clearly and overtly connected to our collective commitment and to make the promise and challenge of truth, of reconciliation real in our communities. And I welcome you if you'd like to share your own acknowledgement and recognition and gratitude in the chat box as we go through the webinar. So today, before we begin, I would like to just introduce to you a little bit of background about the Tamarack Institute. If you haven't already been a part of the webinars this week, this will be new to you. And if you have, well, you'll be just hearing it once again. So the Tamarack Institute is based in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And we are an institute that has two primary aspects to our work. The first one is the Tamarack Learning Center, where we support learners through 5 interconnected practice areas, of which you've actually been introduced to this week through the webinar series. And we believe that these 5 practice areas lead to impactful community change. And those areas are collective impact, community engagement, collaborative leadership, community innovation, and evaluating impact. The other part of our work is our place-based programs, which fall under the Vibrant Communities programs. And we support cities and local leaders through the Vibrant Communities to implement large-scale change initiatives to reduce poverty and deepen community. And as well, we also have another project that falls under the Vibrant Communities called Communities Building Youth Futures, which started this past year. So this is the last in a series of the week of webinars where several of you perhaps, or maybe all of you, I'm not sure who's been where, but have been part of the Creating a Culture of Engagement webinar, looking at inquiry and deliberation, the Assets-Based Community Development webinar with Sylvia, the Facilitating Co-Design with Liz, and today I'm welcoming you to the Participatory Approaches to Evaluation. And the goals for today are really to look at what is stakeholder engaged evaluation, how is it different from conventional evaluation practices, what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of this type of evaluation process, and of course we're going to also go into not just the theory of it, but as well I'm going to provide you with some practical tools on how to assess your level of engagement and understand the kind of participatory practice that you might have. So to begin the webinar series, I just want to point out the question, why is literacy about evaluation important? And this is something I think is really relevant to the beginning of a conversation about evaluation, because when we talk about evaluation, often the reaction of those we're talking to is exactly what you see here, maybe to run in the other direction. Navigating the sea of evaluation literature and tools can be a daunting task, and there are numerous approaches and types and methods and tools, and the language of evaluation can sometimes be overwhelming. And these sometimes feel like an impossible puzzle to figure out. Additionally, we often ask organizational leaders, staff, funders, and community stakeholders to participate in one way or another in deciding several different aspects to the process. And these often feel like an overwhelming task to making decisions about who should lead and be involved, and how should evaluation be approached, what should the focus be, what resources are needed, and when it will be done. And this can really create a sense of anxiety or strain, or it might push people in the opposite direction. And so we often want to just ensure that the list of questions that we want to engage with are not as complex as they seem to be. So just to go over again, sometimes the language of evaluation can often be intimidating and maybe foreign to non-evaluators. And it might be overwhelming. There might be an overwhelming number of choices to make about how to go about doing our evaluation work. And so this can feel a bit daunting. So I'm hoping today will give you a little bit of insight into how to talk about evaluation and think about how to move forward with your planning. This I thought was a nice little addition, because I think often when we talk about evaluation, it's, at the beginning of every evaluation, Chris Lissy is the cartoonist and writer of these particular cartoons, and you could find them at freshspectrum.com. It's a little evaluation humor. I know how our project works. No, you don't. So why do we do evaluation? What's the value in doing it? We're just starting to plan our evaluation. Which methods should we consider? All of them. So again, sometimes, if we don't have the expertise or capacity to make decisions about evaluation, it can be challenging. So I'm going to just go through, because I'm presenting today really about how to think about community engaged evaluation approaches. I'd like to just talk a little bit first about what are the nuances and the differences between conventional evaluation and community engaged participatory practices. So why do we do evaluation? Often we do evaluation because we want to look at the accountability and the evidence of results. So usually that means that it's a summative evaluation, which is to helps determine what support might continue, or what has happened in the experience so far. How has it been successful? Summative means that you're doing evaluation usually at the end of a process, and we want to understand what results were achieved. In community engaged process, why do we do evaluation is really about accountability and transparency, maybe collect evidence of impact. And often it empowers local actors, and this might also be why we want to do it, because we want to ensure that we're building capacity at the community level for people to be able to assess their own actions, and also to look at the actions that come out of the outcomes and learn and implement changes that are necessary. And also strengthening relationships among collaborators is another good reason why we want to engage in community engaged process. So who's leading evaluation? Usually in a conventional process, like traditionally when we do evaluation, and you might have experience with this, external evaluation professionals or senior managers and leaders might be making the decisions about why we're doing evaluation. So they would be the ones leading it. The beneficiaries and stakeholders are usually involved in the information level as informants only, where we're relying on them to understand the data. Who's leading in a community engaged approach would be community organizations, stakeholders, facilitators are often engaged. Maybe an evaluation professional or expert might be used to facilitate a process, but not necessarily be the one leading the decision making. And again, so when does the evaluation take place? Usually it takes place traditionally upon completion, maybe sometimes midway through a process, but typically evaluation has been used often as an add-on at the end where we're wondering how successful the process has been. And so we implement an evaluation. That's starting to change, often where donors are more interested in including an evaluation plan in the proposals themselves. So when does evaluation take place in a community engaged process? Usually this means that it's a continuous implementation. So this is happening from the planning, and it's more strategic. So it would be designed from the beginning of the intervention when it was also being designed with the plan. So there's parallel learning happening. And considering it's a monitoring process, usually that's often important to the aspect of the evaluation itself. Measurement is defined conventionally, usually by externally defined indicators. So external metrics might be applied to that. They're mostly quantitative, meaning that they're statistical and related to cost perhaps and efficiency. Usually it uses scientific objectivity where distancing of evaluators from participants was typically appreciated and valued rather than direct participation. And uniform procedure, meaning like limited access to results, and there's not a lot of transparency. Usually a report would just be written up by an evaluator and given to the leaders of the organization to do with it what they might need to. So in a more participatory approach, measurements are usually defined on the ground. So internally defined indicators, shared measurement concepts and metrics. It's inclusive of auto-evaluative process, which means self-evaluation and reflective critical reflection. Qualitative methods are usually valued. And as I understand it, that would be very attractive possibly to your group, given that you're doing a lot of collaborative work. And what is it about? So conventionally, it would be about predetermined indicators of success, as I mentioned, that are often associated to understanding the results in relation to the cost analysis, and really more like a return on investment only. And community engaged evaluation often includes as well defining and designing the indicators in a shared way in the process where the team and stakeholders that are involved in the evaluation experience take on different roles depending on the type of participatory or collaborative evaluation process used. And really also that has both advantages and disadvantages and depends on the available resources. And I'll go over just quickly what some of those might be. Advantages and limitations to participatory evaluation. Some of the advantages are that the questions stay locally and culturally relevant, which might lead to higher value among community members. It's been shown that the more local it is, the more ownership that the local communities will take to the findings, and the actions will be more ready. There's greater accuracy and relevance of the findings coming out of an evaluation that's participatory. It encourages, again, local ownership of outcomes and findings, and it's also more possible because there's a lot more peer-to-peer learning going on and community-based lessons that are happening. It improves understanding of the interplay between causality and transformative learning. So what that means basically is that, you know, what is the reasoning behind the contributions and the impacts to what happened and what took place to produce those impacts is better understood, and therefore there's a certain level of transformative learning that takes place because there's more of an internalized understanding that's going on. It improves program performance and community actions, empowers informants or participants, so it really encourages more meaningful engagement in the practice of doing evaluation. It builds capacity of local actors and leaders, from leaders to citizens. So really in a participatory process, that means that you're engaging community members not only in the data collection, but as well in the various stages of doing evaluation, from the design of the evaluation and the tools and making decisions around what kind of process would be used and what would fit best within the community context. And again, sustain organizational community learning and growth. So there's a continuous learning that generally happens when you're using participatory methods. And there's greater opportunity to scale learning and practice. And then some of the limitations are that, of course, with all of that great learning and that great involvement and design, and it is a greater investment as well. You might need more resources to allocate to capacity building, which is an important part of that process. The duration of the process might be longer because there's more people engaged in the decision-making process. So therefore, it might take longer to, depending on where you're at with this type of work to begin with, there might be a need to do some laying the terrain a little bit. There's a high level of commitment, greater potential for conflicts in that case as well, because there's more people involved and there's more organizations and potentially more diversity in the participation. There's a lack of experience and skills in evaluation and design and implementation. So often that doesn't mean that there is no experience. Often there will be some experience within the group that is involved, but there might be a need to build that up. And sometimes, roles and leadership and power dynamics can be unclear. And so again, that takes a little bit more time to determine and work through. Sometimes there could be a misalignment of the design and the implementation if there's some challenges in terms of the planning that went on. And of course, there could be a lack of facilitation skills involved, which is really important when you're working in a participatory manner. So I'm just going over some of the theory here, and then I will get into some of the tools on how to work with this kind of process. So using evaluation findings and using an evaluation process, when you're doing evaluation in a participatory way, it really can lead to new learnings and strategies. A shift in the thinking and mindset is really helpful, and it's actually just happens as the process is demonstrated in the community. Often there's a change in mindset and understanding about the role evaluation can play in our work. It's very valuable for demonstrating evidence of impact. It shifts the approach to the work itself as well, because we're thinking through the design of an evaluation in parallel to designing perhaps the interventions and the activities, and therefore how we want to integrate evaluation into our existing activities is something that we try to do more smoothly and fluidly without it being a separate part of the work itself. And it contributes to producing change itself as a result. And so findings use, when we talk about findings use in evaluation, there are 3 different ways we can talk about it. Instrumentally, which means that we're using the findings from an evaluation in directly applying it as new knowledge to the way we think about our work, and perhaps it can lead to new strategic directions. Conceptually, findings can be used where maybe you're not necessarily using the findings right away, but they're being used as a way of grounding thinking in future work and future directions of our work. And they're not necessarily new actions will be coming out of it directly, but it helps us to think differently about how we do our work. And then symbolically, findings can be used symbolically to support the direction of our thinking, whereby, for instance, you might have several evaluations that have been done in the past, and you might decide, we want to review all of the findings from these different evaluations that took place and see how this might influence some change in the way we're thinking about our work. Process use, when it comes to stakeholder engaged evaluation process, is really important because the process itself is what helps to strengthen credibility and ownership of the evaluation findings and outcomes and the evidence that we're learning. It builds evaluation capacity within our community or among stakeholders that are involved in the evaluation from the beginning. And as well, that also means that it's building the evaluation capacity of stakeholders who are a part of our community and a part of the work that's being implemented. So they start to think also in a different way about how to make this work successful. It's learning focused. Also, it has the capacity to strengthen networks and relationships, because a big part of participatory evaluation processes is the relationship building and the trust and the learning process that takes place. And it helps us to establish a shared understanding and perhaps build a little bit of common ground around the work that we want to do, that we've done, and also the work moving forward. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and the question and answer box is available through Zoom. I will try to also just, if I see anything that's standing out from the beginning and that needs clarification, I'll try to respond to you right away. So This is actually a really fantastic book, and I'm using this framework. I use these frameworks a lot in terms of conducting participatory evaluation or stakeholder engaged evaluation processes. David Fetterman is a really well-known evaluation expert, and he's been doing this work for over 30 years. And this is a book that came out last year, Collaborative Participatory and Empowerment Evaluation, Stakeholder Involved Approaches, which I thought would be something to share because I think that I draw a lot from his work in the way that I do my work. And I think it's very valuable the way he presents information. And here's another drawing from Chris Lissy, which actually sums up very well the role of an evaluator in these different kinds of process for stakeholder engaged evaluation. So collaborative process really means that the evaluator, if you see the evaluator standing up in front of the group and they're saying with the ongoing support, we can make this evaluation a success. And really what role the evaluator is playing is really as the decision maker and the leader of the design and the planning of the process. But they're relying on the group that engaged them as an external evaluator to also support the decision making that's taking place. So the role of the evaluator is really very direct, and they're more accountable and in charge of final decisions. In a participatory evaluation process, the evaluator really is working together with the group. And so you would have somebody coming in and become part of the team and really make decisions together and really look at the work as a team effort and decide on how to move forward. So the role is really jointly shared. There's no definitive control by the evaluator of the entire process. And therefore that means that a range of program staff or community intervention, like a community evaluation team, can be also arranged. And so they might work with an evaluation committee or advisors that are more grounded in the community itself, or the stakeholder groups. And then empowerment evaluation, you could see here the evaluator is actually sitting in the back, and they're just a part of the team and wanting to support the team that's actually the ones who are leading the decision making and producing all of the tools and developing the process for data collection and analysis. So really the role of evaluator in this particular context is really the most interesting in way of supporting communities to take ownership of the evaluation outcomes, because they act more as a critical friend. And so they're really there to sort of offer suggestions or provide questions to the group when necessary or when called upon. And so it's a different dynamic that gets created in terms of the evaluation experience and the evaluator. And so just to go over again, so the role of the professional evaluator in these three types of community engaged processes really shows that the professional evaluator sort of, the more the community intervention becomes a more participatory experience where empowerment evaluation becomes front and center for the group, the professional evaluator really becomes more of that external critical friend. And it's really interesting because when I was working on a project last year with a multi-sectoral group around gender-based violence for girls in Indigenous communities, we really started off as more of a participatory process where I came in and was really working together with the group to lead and make the decisions with the group, but really provide my expertise. And as we got more and more engaged in the process, we realized that this group really needed somebody who was more acting as a critical friend. And I stepped outside the circle a little more and became just more of a critical friend and less of the expert directing traffic, which was great. And they ended up producing a phenomenal evaluation framework from that experience. So again, just to go over as just a final piece around the theoretical understanding, really, so again, stakeholder engaged practices really create a strong appreciation for centering stakeholders as part of the evaluation team and at the level of designing and developing the process, the tools, or involved in data collection, analysis, and reporting. And so really there's a very highly engaged experience that starts to take place at the community level. And of course, this supports the critical learning throughout a duration of a project cycle that really helps and inspires a lot of course corrections in the intervention itself. So the evaluation plays this there's a duality of roles that takes place where the evaluation is not just there to assess whether or not the intervention is, if there's success being achieved and results are being achieved, but really it ends up becoming a part of a process that encourages strong learning and a lot of adjustments made to the intervention that can help to strengthen the outcomes in the long term, which is what we demonstrate as also as impact. So I'm going to move on now just to a part around assessing the degree of readiness to plan and conduct stakeholder community engaged evaluation. So here's a couple of tools that I'd like to introduce you to that will help you hopefully to guide some of the decision making and thinking that you might want to do to embark on a more participatory evaluation process. So this is what we look at and we call a spectrum of community engaged evaluation. And I'm really sorry, the writing might be a little bit small. I hope you could see it on your screen clearly. So this, I created this, I drew from a couple of different tools that I was recently introduced to, and I've overlaid it against the three different types of evaluation process that David Fetterman put forth around collaborative, participatory, and empowerment processes. And you can see here that when you're on the spectrum and you're looking at it and there's no engagement really means that the external evaluator is leading a process of evaluation and that decisions being made are really in the hands of the evaluator for the most part, and maybe a couple of key leaders in the organizations or in the collaborative. As you move along the spectrum, you could see that there's more engagement with community members and stakeholders that get more directly involved. If you move collaborative means as well, like, information is being collected from community members, so there's some level of engagement of community in the building of the evidence. Then there's data is collected by community members, so that means that there's a little bit more engagement. They're not just sort of the bystanders who are being asked to share their stories and their experience, but they actually are doing the data collection as well. And they might be doing some peer-to-peer data collection or participate in some sort of interview situation or a survey situation, but they're the ones who might have designed those processes or starting to get involved in that. And then participatory, so in a participatory process, they become more engaged. There's planning and some co-design of the evaluation process, which includes, again, like input from community members or stakeholders that are involved in the interventions. And then as you move along the line, you could see that, community members are becoming more engaged in not only the design, but as well as in the data collection and analysis and perhaps some of the reporting. And when you get to fully engaged, at that point, it really means that the evaluation practice and process is really being led by the community, and that the leaders or the evaluation experts are really on the periphery, again, as that critical friend. And so before we go on, just to get a sense of how to use the tool, I'm going to put up a poll right now, which will I'm going to get Duncan to put up the poll right now. There you go. So the question is, to what extent do you and your organization employ stakeholder or community engaged evaluation practices, and to what degree? So this is the spectrum that I just shared with you, and you can just respond to one of these. And then we can move on to to sharing about how to then use this spectrum to think about how you're doing your work. And I believe I have a sense about what it might be, but I'm not 100% certain what the results will be.
Thanks, Pamela. It looks like we have just about 25% of us voting. Oh, up to 40%. So we'll give it another 15 or 20 seconds.
Yeah, it'll take some time to read through. So yeah, the external evaluator leads and conducts. So that's really the no engagement, and it goes all the way down to fully engaged. Thanks, Duncan.
All right, we're up to 52%, so I'll give it another 30 seconds or so.
Sounds good.
Pamela, what do you think, what would you expect like the spread of a group like this to be answering this question?
What would I what? Sorry?
Do you have any like expectation or a sense of?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have a sense to some degree, but I've learned a little more about the group that's here. So I would say more in the collaborative zone is where I think people might be who are here today, but I'm not 100% certain. It's a guess. Let's see.
All right. So I've just closed the poll and sharing back the results now.
Thank you. So we see actually that the highest sort of level of on the spectrum is around information collected from community members, and then evaluation being designed with input from community members, which is great actually. So there is sort of a balance of experience, and hopefully that means that there's something more that can be developed and learned from this. And I think one of the things that is really interesting, so I would say really, I guessed around here, information collected from communities. And so I think it's relatively in line with what the results were. But I think here's an opportunity where you can use the spectrum to have conversations in your organization and decide, if you come to the realization that now at this current time, this is generally where you lie within the spectrum, then perhaps you can decide that you want to move towards in 3 to 5 months, maybe becoming more participatory in how you're thinking about your evaluation work. And so you can have a reflective conversation with your team or with your collaborative and decide, we want to get to the participatory level. That's where our resources lie, and we are comfortable doing it in this manner. Or you might realize that in a year, you'll be able to build the capacity enough in the community to build enough support where the professional evaluator will really be more on the periphery, and the community members will be co-designing and doing a lot of that in sort of ground level work. So in this process as well, another aspect of thinking is to really understand, when we're doing stakeholder engaged evaluation, a very important part of that is the relationship building component. And so it's really important to understand what degree of transparency, learning, and consent might be feasible and important in your evaluation work that you're doing in your particular context. And this means that we need to consider the who, what, why, where, and how the evaluation process might take place. And so I've put together this spectrum, which we started to use, and it helps to think through maybe what is our level of readiness to do stakeholder engaged evaluation. And so we use the spectrum where we can assess how important is it for us to be participatory. So meaning, will we be collaborative in our approach? Will we try to be a little more, even more inclusive and become more in that participatory range? Or will we do empowerment evaluation where really the community and stakeholders are leading the evaluation process? And so this spectrum is helpful in terms of understanding, so where transparency, how important and feasible might transparency be in your experience, in your current context, in the context that the evaluation might be taking place? And to what degree is transparency important in the community-based evaluation context? So for instance, if you're working on highly socially sensitive issues like gender-based violence or around issues with children, the level of transparency might not be as important or as essential and possible as it might be if you're doing a project on poverty or climate change or some other social issue that you're trying to understand. And then you have to, again, assess what is the degree of learning that's feasible within our evaluation context. And so you decide that the level of learning also is important in our community-based context. So the importance is high and the level of learning is sort of between high, it's high as well, but a little bit in the middle range. And then again, to what degree would consent be feasible within this evaluation context? Who are you trying to engage in the evaluation? How are you working with issues around ethics and consent? How important is that to the community experience? And as well, how feasible is it in the context that you're working in? And so by doing this, it helps you to see a little bit as well, how ready are you to do collaborative, participatory, or empowerment process of evaluation in your work? Maybe it's something you can help you to sort of work towards. Perhaps, for me on this particular in this particular example, we could see that for the most part, it seems like the evaluation context, the readiness would be more around participatory process, where an evaluation professional, to engage an evaluation professional really as part of the team and not necessarily just as a critical friend, as an external, advisor, but really somebody who can help to build capacity of the group before moving into that more community-led focus. And then another interesting part of this is really to look at how can the evaluation process really be inclusive, reflective, and empowering, and how can we build consensus throughout the evaluation cycle. And so the following slides really are about how do we apply some tools to being able to break that down and really look at how do we engage people in a discussion around what we are trying to evaluate. And so here's just an example of step one, where we would validate key activities to be evaluated. So for instance, if I'm in a group where I was working with this group of community-based organizations and academics and researchers and community leaders who were working to evaluate arts-based activities that girls were doing to help empower them on addressing issues around gender-based violence, so the idea would be that we would come around the table and we would decide together what are some of the key activities that are most important to reaching our goals using this frame that you see in front of you. And so everybody would put their names down. And this actually was something done. This was an example that I put together in Mural, which is an online whiteboard platform, which is a really interactive space when you're doing a lot of virtual work these days. It's a really helpful space to be able to do this kind of validation and thinking and reflective conversation and evaluation, actually, a bit of assessment. And so each person would put their name down on the list and then select 2 of the top activities they think are most important to reaching the goals for the work that's being done. And so here you see that funding and youth engagement was one person, capacity building and funding was another, youth engagement. So there's a variety of different answers that were given. And then you go on to step 2, which would really be taking stock. So this really is a helpful activity, again, where you're taking the information from the previous activity and the previous conversation, and you're taking stock with what the activities that were identified by the group. So the funding, communications, youth engagement, sharing results with stakeholders, and capacity building were the key activities that people felt were essential to achieving the goals of the program. And so we're applying a democratic, transparent process, really showing the values that the group has and honoring really the existing mission of the intervention that exists already, but also keeping the respect of the voices and the energy in the room. So as you move through this process, you have the people around the table. We're engaging in a few activities that are helping us to decide what is a priority and then rating the way that they've been working. So here we have the prioritization of activities, where it's a typical activity where you sort of move sticky notes. Each person would have sticky notes for each of those categories that are listed, each of the activities, and then they would put a sticky note next to the activity that they feel also is a priority. So here you see that the main priority that was identified was sharing results with stakeholders. And so it helps you to understand, okay, well, these 5 activities, let's say out of like 10, might be the top activities that we need to consider when we're trying to achieve success with our program, and really have conversations about and start to evaluate what is the performance of each of these and how well are we doing youth engagement, for instance, or capacity building, and then get into more information about what is it that you're trying to accomplish. And then step 3 would be taking stock. So here there's an opportunity to rate the level of effectiveness of each activity to date. And so this is really more of an evaluative component and tool, where the previous ones are sort of laying the groundwork and setting the stage a little bit and building that participation and anticipation of critically looking at what are some of the successes so far with these activities. And here you could see that the different people that were involved in the meeting. So I'm PT, for instance, and Duncan is DF. And you could see that, you know, when we were asked to review the results of what we're looking at, so each person rated their opinion of how effective the project has so far been with funding, with communications, youth engagement, sharing results with stakeholders, and capacity building. And so you could see the different ratings that take place on effectiveness. And from there, one of the critical discussions that can then be had is, it's a very evaluative process where you get to start to talk, you get to start discussing, what are the factors contributing to its current status? Why did Pamela only say, you know, that funding was rated a 4 out of 10, for instance? And why was that? So you start asking her, what was hindering that? What do you feel are contributing or hindering the process of towards more successful outcomes, or supporting that? And then you go through each of these different activities and you can ask these questions. What can we do to strengthen the activity? What other activities need to be considered? How are the activities influencing change and helping to remove barriers? So this is something that you can do both with your collaborative table, or you can do it in the community with community members. It's a really simple activity of just taking stock. And so we really start to understand what is the effectiveness so far, but then it also helps us to build some of that learning muscle into the evaluation process, where we really start to get the bigger picture and start to build a story around the success or the challenges that are being experienced during the process. And then here's just a few ways that I'll share how to do community engaged evaluation. So there's different methods that can be used, and there are so many, but I'll share a few that are my favorites that I really appreciate. When we're doing community engaged evaluation, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this method or not, but one of them is outcome mapping. And outcome mapping is really essential. I think it's a fantastic way to really get a better sense of what's happening on the ground. And it's quite an inclusive process. As you can see, you know, you're starting, in this example, it's starting with summer literacy camps to really understand how it's improving the lives of individuals based on the enhanced literacy that they've can accomplish. And then you map it out as in an activity where, in several activities, and this can be demonstrated through surveys and demonstrated through literature reviews, or it can be evidence that's given in interviews and other means. And when you have all of the data collected, you can start to build a map to show what are the different ways in which success has been achieved, or what are the results telling us? What has contributed to the summer literacy camps building and enhancing literacy for those who are engaged, which ultimately builds a better life for individuals. And so this is a really interesting method that I can't get into the whole explanation of what it is, but it's something that I would recommend you look into further. Another interesting arts-based sort of approach to doing evaluation is photo voice, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a way of engaging community members who are all different age groups or coming from different socioeconomic status situations or language barriers or whatever it might be. Because it's a visual method, it really helps us to see the stories right from the community to the curated sort of shared understanding of the data. And so it's a process where you ask community members to take photos of, for instance, if you want to learn more about, you know, what's happening with children in the school systems, and you want to know whether or not they're enjoying their English class, for instance, and then you ask the children in the English class to go out and take photos of things that represent what they feel about the class that they're in. And so they'll take photos, and then they'll come together and put together a curated gallery of all of these different photos and have little blurbs under each of the photos talking about what their experience has been. And this is a really amazing way to share data with a community that is interested in the outcomes. And finally, most significant change is one that's used fairly often, and perhaps you're familiar with it. It's a really great process for doing, to get to understand the impact of our work. So for instance, when you're using most significant change, I gave the example here, the world's most powerful women 2019. Often data is just shared like that, where we're supposed to believe that these are the world's most powerful women in 2019. But most significant change helps us to deconstruct that and start to ask the questions as to why. Why were these women selected as the most powerful women? What were the criteria that indicated power? What were the criteria that contributed to them achieving success towards their goals? So it breaks apart the story a little bit, and you start to build these different impact stories from the data collection, and then eventually start to analyze it and start to build a story of understanding what has been the most significant change from the work that you've accomplished. What contributions have been made, for instance, from your intervention to the outcomes. And so there's so many ways to do community engaged evaluation. And I feel that if there's a desire to do it, then there are certainly some key points, and those would be, as I had mentioned earlier, to really assess and understand in the pre-planning of an evaluation where you currently are on that spectrum. How engaged is your current work? How ready are you to engage the community further in the evaluation experience? So that's it. That's it for the presentation. I really thank you very much for your interest, and I'm ready to answer questions. And I'll pass it over to Duncan. He's going to help to facilitate that.
Thank you so much, Pamela. I really enjoyed that presentation. Just a reminder, if you have a question or a comment and you haven't submitted it yet, you can do so using the Q&A panel at the bottom of your Zoom client. The first is a question from April, and they said, I see it says to evaluate continually, but what do you recommend to actually implement that? Are you kind of revisiting evaluations every 2, 4, 6 months?
So that's a good question. Usually when we're doing evaluation, if I understood your question correctly, often we end up doing evaluation. We start planning an evaluation process closer to the end of a project, and it's not necessarily wrong, or there's anything wrong with that. Sometimes that is what's necessary, but we want to be able to do a continuous evaluation cycle, which basically means a cycle of evaluation consists of the planning stage, the formative evaluation experience, the summative evaluation experience, and then really looking at how do we, once we've sort of done the analysis, how do we use those findings and those recommendations perhaps to then transfer what we learned from that experience into redesigning the continuous work that you're doing, or to build a new program once this program ends. And so when I say continuous, it can be so for instance, I'll give you an example. If you're doing a training program, for instance, and you want to do an evaluation of whether or not the program is actually accomplishing what the learning goals that you've set out. So you would plan the evaluation while you're planning the intervention, the training itself, and decide when you want to use evaluation during the cycle of training. And so you might decide, if it's a 3-day training, for instance, that you would do evaluation during at the end of each day or at the end of each module. You're going to question the participants and say, was it successful? What did you like? What was useful? What wasn't useful? That kind of thing. And then at the end of the training as well, you would also conduct an evaluation, but it would be more of an overview. Overall, what did you think of the training? How were the facilitators? Was the content appropriate? But during the training, when you get those daily evaluations back, you would then at the end of each day look at those evaluations and say, this is interesting. The feedback we're getting is saying that, maybe the talking about participatory evaluation is really important to participants in the training, but we're not focused enough on how to do it and what they need to do. And so we need to change that. So the next day in the training, it's really a developmental process where you would actually then start adjusting the training program itself to suit more the needs of the feedback to some degree that you're getting back, just to ensure that there's actually, it's responsive and realistic in meeting what the needs are of the participants. And then from there, once that ends and you do this final evaluation, you would take the final evaluation data and you're trying to understand whether or not your training had an impact. Now, you can't necessarily get impact right away when you're ending a training or an intervention, depending on what you're planning to do. But 3 to 6 months later, you would then go back perhaps and do a follow-up evaluation with the people who were involved in the training and ask them how they're using what they learned. Did they transfer their knowledge and skills into their work? Were they able to achieve some changes in the way that they're working as a result of the training that they did? What were the contributions from that training? And so that would be sort of the follow-up and transfer. And then that's sort of when you would be able to understand impacts more realistically, because often outcomes and impacts don't necessarily occur right when in the process of doing an activity, but you really see the results later on, where there's an opportunity for not only knowledge to change, but behavior starts to shift as well. So the shifts in mindset and behavior don't happen necessarily at the same time. So there is a need for sort of this continuous evaluation monitoring process. I hope that
Wonderful.
answers the question.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thanks, Pamela. We have one last question, unless anyone else comes in, but it's from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, can you talk about the professional approach to drafting an evaluation process? How they'd go about sourcing questions and criteria for evaluating from the community? And in your experience, how much of a conversation around why we ask this the way we ask and the limitations of refining factors of quality?
So there's a lot in there. It's a good questions. So, I mean, I'll speak about my professional approach to drafting an evaluation process. I am very interested in being an evaluation professional that engages very much in a participatory way with the groups that I'm supporting to do evaluation. So my process would really be the first stage of a process really is to identify what is the intervention that you're planning to evaluate. And then from there, you would identify, some of the key things that you would need to do is a bit of an environmental scan, get a sense of what are the needs that a needs assessment really of why are you doing an evaluation, sort of ask those when, why, what, when, how, why, and where questions, and do a bit of a needs assessment to get a better sense of what would be the most valuable focus for the evaluation. If, in a lot of cases we're talking about evaluation, there are certain outline needs already predetermined based on funders' requests and, perhaps organizational needs. But also there's another element to that where you can also integrate a needs assessment where there's a desire for learning that's taking place. So you really want to understand, why am I doing this evaluation? What value will it have, and where will it contribute to improving our work and strengthening the way we're planning our future work? And so I would really start with a needs assessment. And then from there, I would take it really to developing a theory of change and or a logic model. So you really start to outline what are some of those key questions that you want to ask. And in a participatory process, you asked, I think I understood about how to go about sourcing questions and criteria for evaluating from the community. And again, I think engaging in some sort of community engagement processes would be very helpful. So you can do anything from, doing a stakeholder engagement wheel, which maybe Lisa spoke about, or one of my other colleagues spoke about. Or you can also talk about maybe just going in and being very deliberate about the kinds of questions you're asking, maybe thematically, or then move. And again, I think go back to the sort of the tools that I gave earlier around this 3-stage process of determining what activities are priority. You can do the same thing about not just activities, but you can also do user profiles, where you're going in and saying what questions would be a priority that you would like to see answered. And so then you can start to define what those questions might be. I think, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks, Pamela. That's our last question for the day, unless anyone else jumps in. But before I throw it back to you, just wanted to mention, just on behalf of the rest of the Tamarack team, it's been a real pleasure putting on this webinar series. And we really value your feedback. So you'll be prompted to complete a very short survey as you leave today's webinar. And we'd welcome any feedback you have on today's experience. So back to you, Pamela.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you also very much for having me. And I hope that it's been a fruitful experience for you. And good luck with your evaluation work.
All right. Have a wonderful day, everyone.